Does it even need to be said that Legend of Zelda Wind Waker had some lofty shoes to fill, being that it was essentially the generational sequel to Ocarina of Time? What do you do as a game developer when you're faced with expectations of that level? Do you take the safe and easy route, modeling your next project off of the game that gave you the success you have now? Or do you do what Nintendo seemingly couldn't stop doing during the GameCube era and do something just totally wacky? I'll let you figure out what side Nintendo ended up going with. Wind Waker is most well known for two defining characteristics: its cartoon-like graphics and its open ocean/sailing mechanic. The cartoon graphics made Wind Waker a really divisive game right off the bat. Fans had been expecting a more realistic art style following a Nintendo GameCube tech demo that was released beforehand, showcasing a sword duel between Link and Ganondorf with down-to-earth graphics more akin to that of Ocarina of Time. Having them come back at you with this would probably leave you a bit confused. So while the perplexing shift to a more cutesy and colorful art style left many fans feeling estranged with Wind Waker early on, the Toon Link vibes ultimately wound up being the game's biggest strength in the long run. This style looks amazing in 2023, and that may have something to do with the fact that the game isn't at all trying to look realistic. In fact, it looks more like a Nickelodeon cartoon than anything. Either way, the simplistic approach to the graphics here make this game very pleasing to the eye. The other defining characteristic, that is, the sailing, gave us an open-world experience made up entirely of ocean travel rather than land. This made for a far more expansive overworld filled with dozens of islands to explore, and many fans early on would find this aspect of the game to contribute immensely to a stronger expedition/adventure, something that was slightly lacking in Ocarina of Time's more sparsely thrown together Hyrule field. The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker was met with mixed responses from fans back when it first released, but it has since come to be a favorite of the series thanks to its timeless graphics and charming appeal to all age groups. But what is in essence a very well-polished adventure that builds on the foundations set by Ocarina of Time very well, Wind Waker is also a very flawed adventure. So flawed, in fact, that I would wager it actually to be one of the most disappointing Zelda titles in history. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker makes a lot of promises early on, promises that it simply could not keep. It promises a vast ocean of unlimited possibilities. Oh man, what am I gonna find on the Great Sea? There's just so much cool stuff and so many places to explore. It promises the biggest Zelda adventure yet, an adventure that in practice wound up being a very short campaign with a mere 6 full-fledged dungeons to complete and probably 10 full hours of gameplay if you skip all the side quests. The common theme with Wind Waker seems to be essentially this. Oh, that's it? And while there is plenty of good to be had here, this is a Zelda game after all. No matter what, it's gonna be at least very good. There's just not enough good here to make this a worthwhile excursion anymore. So if you will, please join me as I dissect your favorite game and ask a simple question. What if The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is not as good as we think it is? Allow me to introduce you to the King of Red Lions. The King is a talking boat who you meet just after the game's prologue. He doesn't let you in much on his backstory or why he's a boat who just so happens to talk, but he plays probably the most pivotal role in this entire game. He introduces you to sailing, the core mechanic of Wind Waker that probably defines the game's entire legacy. What makes sailing so important is the fact that it is the primary mode of transportation for Link, as he needs it to travel across the Great Sea from island to island. It is the heart and soul of Wind Waker, and it is the very thing you spend about half your time doing in-game. When you ask somebody what's the first thing that comes to mind when they think of Wind Waker, it's likely they'll immediately go to sailing. Sailing is a very important part of the Wind Waker experience because it adds that extra dimension of expedition. When you're sailing between islands, you can't help but feel like you're really going on a massive excursion. With the amount of distance you're covering and the sheer vastness of this ocean all adds up to feelings of wonder and discovery. Legend of Zelda is all about going on an adventure, and sailing is the core of that adventure. But what happens when that initial excitement of sailing wears off? What do you do when sailing becomes less and less interesting the more you do it? Now that the rose-colored glasses are off, you start to notice how automated sailing is. You start to see how empty the Great Sea is as well. What was initially an awesome opportunity to go out and traverse the ocean and see what you can discover is now slowly becoming a dull formality. Because sailing isn't as interesting as we think it is. It's mundane, boring, and there's only so much you can do to keep yourself occupied while you wait to arrive at your destination. And the ocean? Well, this ocean isn't the expansive playground filled with limitless potential discoveries like you think. It's actually a big empty wasteland with a handful of actually interesting islands mixed in with a boatload of teeny tiny islands that serve next to no purpose. The few islands that actually matter, such as Outset Island, Windfall Island, or Dragon Roost, all serve a primary purpose of advancing the story. These are the big islands that usually house dungeons for you to complete, or they have significant side quests that lead you to important treasures. These islands hold plenty of substance simply because they have to. Their purpose is literally to advance you forward. But then there's all the other islands that don't get as much attention. These are usually the small inlets or reefs that have one singular purpose to them, and that is generally to either get you rupees, a piece of heart, or a treasure chart. These islands overall are majorly underwhelming and usually very annoying to visit. The reefs, for example, require you to sail in and defeat all the enemy cannons and ships posted about the area. Following that, a treasure chart will appear for you to collect as your reward. The reefs are honestly the worst because they require you to put in so much effort all for a single chart. A chart that will oftentimes lead you to some rupees, or even worse. A chart that shows how many heart pieces are located in each sector of the map, but also doesn't bother telling you specifically where they are or how many you've already collected up to that point. Rupees are definitely a valuable resource since you do need them for the Triforce Shard quest towards the end of the game. But it still does not feel like a valuable use of my time to go through the whole ordeal of destroying all the enemy ships and cannons, and on top of that, having to change the wind direction in order to fly to the little island within the reef that has the chart for me to collect. It's not a stimulating process in any way, shape, or form, and generally when that happens in a game, that usually means it's now become a chore. And having something become a chore in your game is probably one of the worst case scenarios for any game developer to face. Don't at me. That is generally the situation for most of these forgettable little islands, honestly. They all feel like chores. Crescent Moon Island is another one guilty of having next to no purpose. Basically all there is to find on this one is a single treasure chest and maybe a blue choo-choo. Blue choo-choos are quite rare and will give you blue chew jelly that can be made into a strong blue potion which replenishes your health and magic mirror fully, but the need for this can be easily fulfilled by traveling to the Forest Haven and killing a bunch of the Dekubabas there for their Korak seeds, and then cashing those in with one of the little guys who actually lives there for a blue potion. So really, Crescent Moon Island has one singular purpose to it. Or how about the Archipelagos, screw it, I'm talking about these islands, these ones. You come here, and it's just a bunch of cargo rocks hanging out. It's a decent place to nab some gold feathers for that one side quest on Dragon Roost Island, but that's it. You know, nothing in this world would actually surprise me less if it turned out the developers only put these here because they realized very late in the development process that there simply weren't enough cargo rocks in the game, period. So they put these islands here and just said, let's just throw in a bunch of those weird bird things and call it a day. Can we also talk about the Great Fairy Islands and how lazily they were shoehorned into this game? There's a handful of these to find, and they all have great fairies who will offer upgrades to your wallet, bomb bag, and arrow capacity. But they are so one-note and uninspiring in presentation that it's a wonder why they each have their own island to themselves. Basically, all you gotta do when you find one is make sure you have the right item to get past whatever barrier is blocking the entrance to one. And then you receive your reward and you're on your merry way. Like, Jesus, seriously? You can't tell me these couldn't have been included on one of the bigger islands in a more creative fashion. It's just plain lazy on the developers' part that they just plopped them all on their own islands and called it a day. In general, Wind Waker's Great Sea has dozens upon dozens of islands for you to explore, but only about 90% of them are actually worth exploring. But wait, I thought the whole selling point of this game was that it would feature a humongous ocean called the Great Sea. Yeah, not so great now, are ya, biatch? The Great Sea is easily the most underwhelming aspect of the whole game, and to be honest with you, I am disappointed. The majorly deflating nature of the Great Sea doesn't make dealing with sailing any easier either. In fact, it only makes it a lot worse. Once you've figured out that much of the sea is filled with mindless filler, it makes the prospect of discovery far less exciting. because you become conditioned by about the midpoint of the game to not expect much from the whatever you find on the Great Sea. It's no longer, holy crap, look at that big island appearing on the horizon, I wonder what secrets I'm gonna find there. It's more like, oh, look, another island. It's probably gonna be another reef or some garbage like that. I'll pass. I know that nostalgia is a hell of a drug, and many, many people have fond memories of scaling the Great Sea and just taking it all in. But the unfortunate reality of Wind Waker is that its overworld in many ways is just as, if not more empty than Hyrule Field from Ocarina of Time, except on a much larger scale. It had way more potential than Hyrule Field, but the potential got fumbled, because the Great Sea is basically as one-dimensional as it gets. At this point, it's basically down to the main quest of the game to save it from sinking any lower. See what I did there? The main quest of Wind Waker centers around Link once again, but this is a different version of Link, who is heavily implied to be a direct descendant of the Hero of Time from Ocarina. This Link is just as lazy as the child Link from that game, but instead of being portrayed as an outcast, he's instead portrayed simply as a normal kid who lives a seemingly enriching life on Outset Island. With no indication of him being a child of destiny, or him needing to find some greater meaning to it all, he's just a regular kid. However, Link is forced to go on a journey to save his sister Errol after she was kidnapped by a giant bird who mistook her for a different girl that was dropped on the island named Tetra. Tetra is the leader of a gang of pirates who travel the Great Sea far and wide in search of treasure. She offers Link a ride on her ship to the Forsaken Fortress where Errol is being held captive. Upon arrival, Link's attempt at breaking her out is immediately shot down by that massive bird from before, and he is sent flying across the Great Sea to his untimely demise. To cap off this entire prologue, Link awakens to discover that he has been rescued by none other than the King of Red Lions, and thus the true adventure can finally begin. This entire prologue sets the scene nicely without leaning too hard into the predetermined destiny nonsense like Ocarina of Time did. That game hits you right out of the gate with the Destiny Child storyline, but Wind Waker doesn't do that. Instead, all it's trying to do at this particular moment is set up a simple story of some regular boy mustering up the courage to set out and find his little sister. The reality, however, is that this boy is in fact another child of destiny like the Link that came before him, but that is only hinted at in small doses. I do particularly enjoy how naturally this story is set up, as you really do feel an urgency in real time to start the adventure, unlike in Ocarina, which basically just tells you how everything is and how it's going to go right off the bat. You are a child of destiny who has to go out and fight evil. Now go do it. It's a little hard to immediately connect with the story when it's just spoon-fed to you like that. But here, you see everything unravel right before your very eyes, and that motivates you more to actually carry out the main quest. What's that very important phrase I'm searching for that totally applies here? Oh yeah, it's the show don't tell ideology. When you see everything playing out in front of you, it makes you care more. When the game just kinda tells it to you in text boxes, yeah, it's a little hard to care about text boxes. Wind Waker has a very good prologue sequence that admittedly drags in the middle while you're fucking around with Nico. I hate these little obstacle courses he has you do. But, keeping on track with the story, it's only once you've met up with the King of Red Lions is it slowly unraveled to you that Link may actually be the child of destiny that the prophecy foretold. Link is instructed by the king to travel to 3 places across the sea, with each one holding a pearl that will be needed to uncover one final test for Link to take before he is ready to be deemed the true hero of Wind. One of them is found on Dragon Roost Island, another in Forest Haven, and another being held by a giant whale. The first 2 pearls require you to enter 2 distinct dungeons, Dragon Roost Cavern and the Forbidden Woods. These dungeons more or less act as a precursor dungeon, designed to teach you what you can expect in Wind Waker's dungeons going forward. If it sounds like I'm basically just calling these tutorial dungeons, it's because they kind of are. They're incredibly easy dungeons, as they probably should be since they're the first 2 in the game. But when you take into account that there's only 6 original dungeons total in-game, these should have probably had slightly more inspiring layouts to them than they actually did. The situation is quality over quantity here, but the quality that is here is still slightly deflating. Dragon Roost Cavern is honestly a pretty cool theme for a dungeon, and while it's wrong to expect a whole lot from the first dungeon in the game, I still can't help but wish there was more here. The grapple hook mechanic that encompasses this dungeon is okay, but it's hampered by how annoying it is to have to stop your momentum mid-swing to change direction. I do think it's a nice touch how part of the dungeon takes place outside the cavern on the side of the mountain, where you can just look out over the cliff and see how high up you really are. Also, the boss of Dragonroo's Cavern is super badass when he has the armor on, but then looks like a complete bitch when the armor's off. The Forbidden Woods is overall not a great second dungeon. The dark, gloomy aesthetic and the extremely minimalistic music makes this a mind-dulling experience. And yes, I'm pretty sure mind-dulling is a new word that I just made up for this video. Let me just go ahead and trademark that. Yoink. It's just not an interesting dungeon to exist in, as there just isn't enough life here. It's definitely a place I could see myself taking a nap in, but not fighting giant moths. It's also very easy and straightforward, just like Dragonroo's Cavern, and once again I am left feeling shafted by another dungeon. I suppose it is kind of fun using the Deku Leaf as a sailing device on various platforms, but the sections that require the boomerang are almost insultingly easy to figure out. The switches that you need to hit with the boomerang are practically screaming in your face to hit them, with how much they stick out like a sore thumb, making it so you can basically do the rest of the dungeon on autopilot after you get the boomerang. The boss here is pretty great, however, and while it is pretty easy to figure out that you need to chop off all his tentacles with the boomerang, he does not make it easy for you to do so. You have to keep moving in order to dodge the tentacles that rise out of the ground while you simultaneously try to aim your boomerang at the ones hanging from the ceiling. It sends off an otherwise mediocre dungeon with a bang. Now it's time to collect the third pearl before we begin our final test to prove we are the true hero of Wind. Now, rather than just make this process straightforward like the first two pearls did, the developers opted to turn this pearl into one massive, unnecessarily drawn-out fetch quest, much to the dismay of gamers everywhere. You have to travel to one island, where you find out that you now have to travel to a different island to get bombs, just so you can travel all the way to a third island on the other side of the sea, where you can use the bombs to get to Lord Jabu Jabu, the giant whale who's been keeping the third pearl safe from evil this whole time. This entire process of sailing around different islands on a wild goose chase is obvious padding, and it's horrible. It's just downright horrible to get through. I know there were lots of last-minute changes behind the scenes that caused the developers to birth this monstrosity of a sequence, but man, this is really where Wind Waker exposes just how mind-melting its sailing mechanic can be. Easily the worst section of the game right here. If you enjoy 20 or so minutes of straight sailing with yet another shitty pirate obstacle course serving as an intermission, then hey, more power to you. But me? I'm not that guy. Once you've collected the third pearl and placed each pearl in its assigned spot on the map, then the third dungeon, the Tower of the Gods, appears before you, acting as your final test to see if you are truly worthy of being the next hero. This one is probably my favorite of the first three dungeons, because it's split up into three distinct sections, with each one having its own unique central mechanism guiding you through it. The first section has you traveling by boat between rooms while the water level rises and falls around you. The second has you using the newly acquired command melody to lead three sentient statues to their assigned posts where they can light the path to the next area. The third area is just a simple straightforward trek to the top of the tower, with varying enemies trying to slow you down. This isn't the traditional approach to Zelda dungeons that we're used to, and I really enjoy that about it. It's not just a series of offshoot rooms and hallways that blend together with no distinction between them, but instead, it's three separate, unique sections that have you doing something different in each one. The boss, however, is unfortunately another miss. His main attack is as two floating sentient hands who will, through a team effort, try and crush you. But it is cringeworthy how long it takes for them to do, well, anything. This boss comes right at you in the beginning, saying you're gonna get these hands, but then he just sits there staring at you, and you're basically free to shoot the eyeball on the hands and expose his weak point, and he won't do a damn thing. You know it's bad when you actually have to try to wait for a boss to attack you. That's just pathetic. This boss could have been so much better if he had just been, I don't know, a little more aggressive? You know, kind of like how a boss is supposed to be. Once you've completed the Tower of the Gods, the King of Red Lions acknowledges you as worthy, and leads you through a golden portal which, holy crap, takes you down to the bottom of the ocean. I suppose while we wait for these two jabronis to float to the ocean floor, I want to take this time to touch on a very important aspect of this game that I completely forgot about. The Wind Waker. You know, that thing that's in the title of the freaking game. Yeah, I forgot to talk about this earlier, mainly due to the fact that the King of Red Lions just sort of randomly gives it to you in a completely forgettable cutscene when you arrive at Dragon Roost Island. Come to think of it, this cutscene is so out of nowhere and dismissive that it makes me question just how important the Wind Waker really is. It does its job of changing the wind direction for you and playing specific songs when the time calls for it, but really, how much attention does the Wind Waker get in the main story outside of this cutscene? Regardless, Link and the King finally arrive at the bottom of the ocean, where they discover this mysterious, unnamed castle that appears to be frozen in time. It's here that Link discovers the Blade of Evil's Bane, the Master Sword, probably one of, if not, the most iconic item in Zelda history. He removes the sword from its pedestal, thereby unfreezing time and essentially reviving all the scattered enemies who are left frozen in the castle. This has now become an awesome opportunity for you to completely clean house with your newfound weapon, and I gotta say, this is a really clever way of just giving you plenty of bodies to test your new sword on. Because you know that thousands of kids everywhere were just itching to try out the Master Sword once they had it. And hey, Nintendo knew this and delivered that in tenfold. Well played. Now that you have the Master Sword, it is time to wreak havoc on the Forsaken Fortress and save your sister once and for all. But wait, there's something else Link needs to do while he's there. Something he wasn't at all concerned with last time, but now absolutely needs to do above everything else. He has to confront the Dark Lord, the true evil king of vile evilness. So evil that it's vile, and so vile that it's evil. Ganondorf. But first, he has a giant fucking bird blocking his path. So Link needs to take out the Helmarock King that originally kidnapped his sister, and it's here where we put what is probably the most unneeded item in the game to good use, the Skull Hammer. I can probably count on both hands the amount of times you actually need this thing to progress in the game, and this boss fight is one of them. Yes, the Helmarock King is its own boss, because apparently the Forsaken Fortress is being counted as one of the 6 original dungeons in-game. I mean, I guess that tracks, since you do come back here on 2 separate occasions, but the second go-around is a complete joke, because there's no puzzles to solve or anything like that. It's basically just a straight shot to the top of the fortress, with a few enemies put in your path to slow you down. So that leaves us with a pretty disappointing 4th dungeon, in my opinion. But man, if this place doesn't have a badass boss fight, the Helmarock King is probably the 2nd best boss in the game, because it's just so epic. You're fighting the same monstrous bird that kidnapped your sister, and you're fighting him at the very top of the same prison that she's been held at for basically the whole game up to this point. And it truly just feels like we've been building to this moment for a long time now. I really like his attack patterns here too, because they are just so sporadic. You don't know when he's flying at you whether or not that means he's just coming down to land, or if he's gearing up to sideswipe you with his massive claws. And unlike the first boss of the game, this bird doesn't look like a complete wimp after he loses his armor. The moment where the Helmarock King is defeated truly feels like an accomplishment, and I love how they presented his defeat as a big deal, because it is. It's a moment of reclamation for Link, and deserves to be presented as an event where things come full circle for him. This bird tossed Link aside like he was a complete joke in their first confrontation, and it's just so satisfying seeing Link come back to defeat him emphatically in the end. With Helmarock King out of the way, it's time to face Ganondorf. Keep in mind, this is the same Ganondorf that was defeated by the Hero of Time during the adult timeline of Ocarina of Time. Because of his defeat, Ganondorf is not as outwardly bombastic as you would expect from an evil king. Instead, he carries an eerily calm presence with a more calculating demeanor. He's still the same heartless bastard from before, but it seems like this time he's learned to keep his ego in check, instead vying for a quieter and more subtle approach towards fulfilling his evil plans. Link makes the first move in their confrontation, but apparently he forgot to check the batteries in his blade before the fight, because it doesn't do jack. Luckily, the badass pirate chick from before, Tetra, swoops in just in time to distract Ganon while the two of you make your escape. During the battle with Ganon, it became apparent that Tetra was actually embedded with the Triforce of Wisdom, the same Triforce the fabled Princess Zelda held onto from years past. Everything is starting to come together here as we discover that not only is Tetra the real Princess Zelda, but that the King of Red Lions, that talking boat who you've been traveling with this entire time, is actually the real King of Hyrule, Daphnis Nohansen Hyrule. He uncovers pretty much everything that has already been subtly implied to you since the beginning. that the entire land of Hyrule was submerged underwater in order to protect it from evil, and that Link and Tetra are direct descendants of the Hero of Time, and the original Princess Zelda, respectively. This is an extremely powerful cutscene because it unravels the entirety of Wind Waker's story, and even though it's mainly just a wall of text, there were already enough hints given to you up to this point for you to piece together for yourself at your own pace, so this cutscene was mainly a formality to all of that. Now that everything is out in the open, there's only one thing left to do now before we face Ganon. We must travel to the Earth and Wind Temples and restore the power to repel evil back into the Master Sword, and then we can finally face Ganon, man to man, and defeat him once and for all. Oh, wait, what? The Triforce of Courage has been shattered into 8 pieces and scattered across the Great Sea? And we need to go find them? Fuck! Okay, so it's almost time for us to cover one of the most divisive aspects of this game. I know I sound like I'm beating a dead horse by saying that over and over again, but this time I mean it for real. But before we do that, we have 2 more dungeons to complete, and these ones are doozies. Not in the sense that the dungeons themselves are all that challenging. I mean, why would they be? Every dungeon up to this point has been pretty much a cakewalk. I mean in the sense that all the things we need to do leading up to them are quite a handful. So, let's say it's your first time playing this game, and you've gotten to the last 2 temples. You arrive at the Earth Temple only to discover there's a giant stone blocking the entrance that you can't destroy with normal bombs. You find out through sheer hearsay that there's an island somewhere out there that conveniently houses the exact item you need to move that stone. You go to that island, enter this sad excuse for a mini dungeon, and collect the power bracelets. Awesome, now you head back to the Earth Temple, remove the stone, and head inside. But you discover there's another massive stone tablet blocking your path again, but this one has a song written on it. It turns out that a Zora sage has been guarding this temple, and the song written on the tablet needs to be played by someone with the same instrument as her to remove it. So now you need to leave and go on another fetch quest to find the girl who carries that same instrument. Turns out that girl was Medley, and she hangs out on Dragon Roost Island. So you go there, play the song on your Wind Waker for her, and she has an out-of-body experience. She discovers that she herself was a sage all along and agrees to come with you to the Earth Temple. You finally make it back to the Earth Temple, play the song, and remove the stone tablet. Now, after all that, now you can enter the Earth Temple. This sequence of events leading up to the last 2 remaining dungeons highlights one of the worst aspects of Wind Waker overall. There is too much padding towards the latter half of this game. It's the same situation as back when you were sailing aimlessly around the ocean trying to get bombs so you can gain access to that 3rd pearl before the Tower of the Gods. It feels completely contrived having to sail back and forth between places just so you can secure one single power-up, item, or song, or whatever. All for what? To open a single entranceway? No. It's just not fun. These are the sections of Wind Waker I roll my eyes at with each playthrough. What makes it even worse is the fact that you basically need to repeat this fetch quest near identically for the Wind Temple, but instead of a pathetic volcano mini dungeon, you get an ice one, and you can sub out Medley for this clown. The only saving graces for all this padding in the last half of the game are the Earth and Wind Temples themselves. As the last 2 official dungeons, these are easily the best of the bunch in nearly every category. They have the best presentation, the best atmosphere, and they are the most complex, and at the very least steer in the direction of being challenging. The bar for dungeons up to this point has admittedly not been set very high, but at the very least these last 2 are good dungeons, whereas the rest of them, maybe minus the Tower of the Gods, have all been mid AF. The Earth Temple has you dealing with darker and spookier themes and enemies, and this is something I dig at Wind Waker considering we haven't gotten much of that up to this point. The Mirror Shield is the highlight of the temple, 1 because it looks freaking awesome, and 2 because it opens up the temple to some actually engaging puzzles that involve light reflection and mechanism triggering. But sadly, the boss battle once again does not live up to expectations. You're fighting a giant Poe, and just like the Tower of the Gods boss, he takes forever to actually do anything. When he does do something, he has maybe 3 attacks. He spits fire at you, he blows at you, and he falls on you. The Wind Temple gets a slight edge over the Earth Temple in terms of complexity, but that complexity does not always translate very well to a good time. The reason for this is because of this tag team situation we've got going on with the sage that comes into the temple with us. We tag team with Medley in the Earth Temple and Makar in Wind. It isn't so bad with Medley because the Earth Temple isn't complex enough that it would make swapping between characters that much of a hassle, but in Wind, man, can you feel it. It is really annoying at certain parts having to switch to Makar, 1 because he's much slower than Medley and also can't fly as well, and 2 because the Wind Temple is much more open than Earth, making Makar's slowness and lack of strong flying capabilities even more jarring when you're just trying to make it across a giant chasm. The Wind Temple is a fine dungeon, in part because it gives you the incredibly useful hookshot, though I do question why we got such a useful tool so late into the game. I don't know, it just seems like something we could have gotten a lot sooner, so that way we could have made more use out of it. The boss for Wind Temple, you know what, I'm not gonna shit on it. It's alright. He put up a decent fight, and it actually does get a little intense when he's flying down towards you, but you can't see where he's coming from, so he just crashes right into you. Definitely one of the better boss fights here. Now that the Blade of Evil's Bane has been returned to the Master Sword, it is now time to face Ganondorf. Let's get ready to rumble! Oh, why'd you have to bring that up? I was really hoping nobody would notice if I just bypassed it. Okay, so I guess we got just one last thing to do. One final task to complete, one last hurrah, and I promise we will get to the final boss. We need to entertain this game's excessive padding one last time with the Triforce Shard quest. The Triforce Shard quest requires us to go around searching for 8 Triforce charts, and in typical Wind Waker fashion, those charts need to be taken to Tinkle Island to be deciphered before we can actually use them to find the pieces of the Triforce. So yeah, to summarize, we need to go find a thing in a place, then we need to take that thing to another place to get it to actually work, then we need to use that thing to find another thing. Am I summarizing the Triforce Shard quest accurately enough? It's just more of the same Wind Waker nonsense we've seen time and time again in this game. A handful of these charts aren't too annoying to find, but some of them do get really involved, for better or worse. The first one that comes to mind is the Joy Pendant chart. This one requires you to bring 20 Joy Pendants to a school teacher on Windfall. Joy Pendants are quite plentiful in the main quest, so you shouldn't be needing to actively try to find these things. But before she is willing to accept these 20 pendants, you first need to play a game of hide and seek with this dastardly group of kids who have been giving this teacher a hard time. Once you've done that, she will exchange the 20 pendants with you for a deed to her own private island. It is on this island that you can find the Triforce chart in this sketchy basement of the cabin located on that island. I don't mind this amount of busy work for a chart in this instance because it actually feels natural, unlike most other padding in this game that feels tacked on. There is one particular chart I hate getting, and that's due to the fact that the build-up to it leads to a completely stupid payoff. Throughout the game, you've been hearing rumblings about a mysterious structure seen floating through the waters at certain times at night. You often find the weather suddenly changing from clear skies to overcast and rain, and you can't help but wonder why. There's something very unsettling patrolling these waters, and someday you're gonna find out what it is. At some point in the game, you come across a chart that shows you where a ghost ship is. Holy crap, it was a ghost ship the whole time. That's so awesome. And the incredible chart designates that the ghost ship is one of the hiding spots of a Triforce chart. Oh man, I cannot wait to find this thing and see what kind of cool, creepy stuff it has to offer. Maybe it'll be a mini dungeon. Maybe it'll have a cool boss fight. I mean, the game has been building this thing up this whole time as something you shouldn't sneeze at, so it's gotta be good, right? Dude, is this a rib? Am I being punked right now? Am I being Eric Andre'd? After all that buildup, after all the rumors and speculation the game threw in your face from the beginning, all the ghost ship had to offer you was 2 pose and a whiz robe. You know what? That's actually pretty good. Well played, Nintendo. Well played. Now that we have all 8 pieces of the Triforce, we can finally dive down into Hyrule again and make a direct assault on Ganon's tower. Oh, by the way, Zelda got kidnapped. So, Ganon's tower is an interesting situation. It comes off like its own dungeon, but I don't count it as one of the 6 main dungeons, primarily for the reason that half of it is repeat content. The first half of Ganon's tower has you completing 4 challenge rooms, with each one matching the theme of the previous 4 temples in-game, not including the Forsaken Fortress or Tower of the Gods. None of these rooms are particularly challenging in any way, but the most interesting part is that they each come with a repeat boss fight of that matching dungeon. You've got Goma, the Big Poe, the Big Centipede, and Big Plant, all back and ready for you to demolish them with the Master Sword. I don't find this section offensive at all. I actually find it quite satisfying being able to just wreck these old bosses with a more powerful weapon. It feels kind of like the game is just handing you some cheat codes and giving you free permission to use them on every boss. Speaking of cheat codes, once you've defeated a phantom version of Ganon and solved a quick room puzzle, you receive the light arrows as a reward for all your troubles. The light arrows are pretty much the most OP item in the game, as you basically can one-shot kill any enemy you want with them. And these things don't just kill the enemy, they obliterate them. Hell, they don't just obliterate them, they make them cease to exist. Now that we've reached the top of Ganon's tower, it's time to demolish the first phase of the final boss. This is Puppet Ganon, who is easily the best boss in the game period, and who might be one of the coolest and best bosses in Zelda history. He has 3 phases to him. 1 is a normal puppet, 2 is a spider, and 3 is a snake or centipede thing. This guy is straight nightmare fuel. Instead of giving us the regular pig version of Ganon that's come in every other Zelda game before this, we get an alive, but also not alive puppet version of that same beast. There is something just so uncanny about fighting a puppet version of Ganon that makes him almost more threatening than if he were the real Ganon. Oh, and for once, he's actually a challenging boss. It gets progressively trickier to hit that orb on his tail with your light arrows with each phase. You really need to lead your shots well if you want to get a hit on him. Especially in the snake phase, because in this phase, his movements are just so sporadic that you have absolutely no idea what direction he may decide to dart towards, or whether or not he may decide to just dart right towards you in the middle of a shot. And let me tell you, seeing that face suddenly come right at you while in first person mode, yeah, that stuff's gonna stick with me for a while. Once Puppet Ganon is defeated, it's now time for Ganon to face the consequences of his actions. This final scene on the roof of his tower is among the most powerful scenes you will find in any Zelda game. It's here that Ganon confesses why he does what he does, why he chooses evil over good, why he envies the people of Hyrule for having it so good while he and his people lived harsher lives in the brutal desert. Of course, none of that matters now because he's about to use the Triforce to bring Hyrule back to the surface and become its ruling overlord. But of course, our boy Daphnis can't let that happen now, can he? He touches the Triforce and makes his wish that the younger generation may have a future on the surface, while the rest of Hyrule may drown for good. Wait, what? The walls are now caving in around Ganondorf. He lost his one chance at infinite power, and in a few short minutes, everybody is gonna drown. Time to cut straight to business and finish this fight. Except this time around, it's a good old-fashioned hand-to-hand sword fight. No magic or nothing. Okay, so Ganon is clearly the superior swordsman here, and we are getting our asses whooped. But thankfully Zelda is hanging around nearby with the light arrows to even the score. I would wager this final boss to be disappointing, in the sense that it's not that difficult or involved. On the other hand, this boss is near perfect in terms of presentation and context. While the fight itself mechanically is pretty much just a waiting game, the energy surrounding it more than makes up for that. This feels like an epic conclusion to an epic story. The music is spot on as it always is with Zelda bosses, and the scenery of the water rushing down all around us as Hyrule slowly submerges is a sight to behold. Once Ganondorf becomes privy to Zelda's attacks, he knocks her the fuck out, and it becomes a one-on-one duel for a spell. Before she eventually wakes back up and fires one last shot at not Ganon, but you, and the arrow bounces off your shield, hitting Ganon so you can swoop in for that one final blow to the skull. The end. This entire final boss was awesome, and capped off the entire story in expert fashion. Ganondorf is dead, or at least his version of dead, and now so is the King of Red Lions. Yes, that's right, the king for some reason decided drowning himself was the best option for the future of Link and Zelda. A jarring little tidbit I noticed with the king is that Daphnis, the physical person, and the King of Red Lions, the boat, feel like 2 completely different people, even though we know that they are literally the same person. I don't know why it feels that way. I guess it may be because a talking boat feels like such a goofy premise for a king to subject himself to. It just seems out of left field for him. Either way, that wraps up the story of The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, and despite the majorly high note this title ends off on, it still wasn't enough to win me over for the entirety of the experience. My biggest issues with Wind Waker's main quest are that the dungeons and bosses are nothing special, and also err too much on the easy side. The King of Red Lions spends far too much time telling you where you need to go, thereby leaving barely any room for the player to really figure things out on their own. And the padding. There is an unhealthy amount of filler in Wind Waker that overuses the game's central mechanic sailing as a means to exploit that filler over and over again. If you skip all the side quests, the main quest can probably be completed in 8 to 10 hours tops, which by the way is incredibly short for a Zelda game, and I guarantee you a solid chunk of that will be spent sailing. It's a cool idea on paper, absolutely, but if you're going to commit to it, you gotta make sure that there's enough cool stuff to find that keeps it interesting, because the Great Sea is among the most empty overworlds in a video game. Now, in spite of all that, there are enough snippets of good in Wind Waker that can be found within the game's main quest to keep this from being an unplayable experience. If you're in the same boat as me, and you don't find Wind Waker to be... Oh, huh? Yeah? You like that pun? Yeah? You thought that was funny? Because I said boat, and this is a game about boats? Get the fuck out of here. See that? That's the door. Use it. Jeez. Who even was that guy? If you are like me and don't necessarily see Wind Waker as a top-tier Zelda game, then listen closely. Here's how weirdos like us can still enjoy this game. Just play the main quest. Don't even think about doing a single side quest, you'll just drive yourself insane. The main quest by itself is at least bearable, and has some awesome storytelling involved in it. The dungeons may be pretty underwhelming, but at least they aren't aggravating in any way. And as for the Triforce Charts, just collect them as you go. Don't try to collect them all at once. You get the incredible chart pretty early on, so that makes it pretty easy to collect them at your own pace anyways. That's my take on how the game can be made more digestible for lesser fans. I hope that in some way quells the anger of you ride or die fans who inevitably will give me the business to some degree in the comment section. Just know that I'm at least trying a little bit here for you guys. I know Wind Waker is very special to many of you, just like how Majora's Mask is special to me, and none of the things I say on this game should change that for any of you. At least that's not what my intent was with this video. But in the case that it does to some degree nullify your once indestructibly high regard for this title, please do not direct your anger at me for doing so. I am not here to stomp on sandcastles, I am just here to state my unfiltered opinion on video games, because that is what I like to do, and that'll never change. Whichever way the wind blows, that is the wind you should covet most. Maybe that wind leads you towards The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, and if that's the case, hey brother, I salute you. But maybe that wind blows you towards something like The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. If that's the case, then stay tuned, because I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm Marky Mark signing off, and I encourage you to go play a game that's extra special to you. Right now. Go on. The wind is blowing.